Okay, so welcome back to the mystical book of Tanya. And Tanya has various parts to it. And we are just beginning. We're in the middle of chapter 1 of Igeret HaKodesh, the Holy Letters. So the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, first Chabad Rebbe, essentially what he's been saying until now is that when it says in Proverbs, in specifically, a woman of valor who can find, and he says that's referring to the relationship, not only husband and wife, that's just a metaphor. What it's really referring to is the relationship between the Jewish people and God. And when King Solomon, one of the verses, I believe it's verse 17 in chapter 31, it says, Chagra be'oz masneha, she girds her loins with strength. So what are loins? So he explained that loins, basically, loins is what holds the abdomen and the head up, right? The loins are the basically begins with the waist and down, and that's what he calls loins, and they hold the abdomen. He says, spiritually speaking, the loins would be faith, and you have the head, which is intellect, you have the heart, which is emotions, and then you have the right hand, which is mainly the love of God, the left hand, which is the awe and fear of God, and faith holds up essentially the head, and if a person doesn't have faith, you wouldn't be able to intellectually generate the following thoughts. So you have to have faith. What are the thoughts? The thoughts are that God created the world from nothing. God animates this world constantly, and God loves his creations, and he loves the human creations, and he brought us closer to us, and God created time. God created space. God created soul, life forces, that we think of something living versus something not living, and so this is all the thoughts. The faith produces these thoughts, and when a person thinks of these type of thoughts, they feel really close back to God, and they'll have their intellect and their emotions all about God, and they'll have their love of God and their fear of God, etc. And by the way, when it says love of God, I mean, it's love of God. There's a couple of levels of love. One of them is love God for reward, and the higher one, of course, is love God because you're just like gobsmacked in his presence, and you're just so, you're in deep love. It is just an incredible, rapturous love. Likewise, fear. There's two levels of fear. There's a fear of punishment, that God is going to kick our little tushies all the way to kingdom come. Or there's a higher level of fear, and that is awe. You're just standing there in awe, and you, God forbid, don't want to embarrass God by doing something negative. So he says, so that is the faith. Faith allows the head to generate these thoughts, which of course leads to emotions. Now the Alter Rebbe is asking, what is the power behind the faith? Right? So a person has faith. Faith is not made in a vacuum. Chances are faith is learned, faith is taught, inculcated. And so the Alter Rebbe wants to get to the bottom line. What is this power behind the faith that is able to upkeep the head and the emotions, the intellect and the emotions. So the Alter Rebbe says, "Who esek," that is being involved. Esek, by the way, is being engaged. Esek is also another in colloquial Hebrew. Esek is business, and it's the same idea. A person puts their kishkas, their inner guts, they give to their business, right? Called blood, sweat, tears, etc. So likewise, a person, when they study Torah, they should engage their entire being. It shouldn't be just to finish the page. It shouldn't be to get it over with. But rather, it should be just where you pour over it, and with deep intensity. So he says the study of Torah gives faith. That's what breeds and increases and enlarges one's faith. And he says it's not just any Torah for that matter. He says it's the oral law. Oral law specifically is is what increases the faith. And he says, why? What is oral law? Oral law is the gilui, is the revelation, right, and the manifestation of God's will, right? So you see, only the oral law, right, manifestly reveals what God's wishes are. If you go to the Torah, as we've discussed many times, the Torah is written very shorthanded. It's written in code. You would never know how to do most of the things if you just study Torah, the written law. So you need the oral law because it reveals exactly what God wants. So the Torah is the Torah. You can't, get better than the Torah, etc. But the oral law is considered the will, right? And it's considered the revelation of the divine will. And he says that in many respects, a will, a want, a wish, right? A will even transcends intellect. Because if you think about it, you have a will, then you have to think how to get that will. So he explains that Torah, mechachma hinafkes, right? Torah itself comes from chachma, right? He says, but so the Torah that we have, that we connect with, resonate with, comes from chachma. He says, but in reality, the Torah's source is a lot higher. Mekora sharsha, its source and its root surpass the level of chachma, and that is what will is, right? So will is like a crown above the head. So since the study of the oral law specifically reveals God's will, so it stands above the intellect. So the Torah we're studying is intellect. But when you study the oral law, you're now getting into the real, clear manifestation of God's will. So it strengthens. Once we understand God's will, right? It strengthens our faith, which in turn will support our head and the emotional, the love and fear of God. Right? And he says, and that is he says in another place in Mishlei, in Proverbs written by King Solomon, it says, Eshes Chayil, a woman of valor, a teret baila is the crown of a husband. So the Alter Rebbe explains that the Kabbalah explains that a woman of valor refers to the oral law. So its numerous revelations, etc., serve as a crown for her husband. And the husband is the chachma. The husband is the wisdom. So the will is above. The will is almost like a crown. Where does a crown sit? A crown sits above the head, not in the head, or not in the same plane as the head, but rather above the head. And he says, and we have it in many places, in the Mishnah, in the Sifri, etc., that says that there's a in the Mishnah there's a rabbinic teaching that says whoever studies Torah laws every day is assured of life in the world to come, because it is the study and the grasp of the oral law that allows one to be receptive to what God wants. Right? And Chagra be'oz matneha, she girds her loins with strength. Ein oz ala Torah. There's no strength but Torah. So this Torah, this oral law, gives koyach, gives strength, right, and power and strength to the loins, which sustain the head, and to strengthen the intellect and strengthen the emotions. Kol chad lefum shiura delay. Each person according to their measure, which is a very interesting thing in itself. While we're all obligated to fulfill the practical mitzvahs exactly the same, from the greatest rabbi to somebody who is a grave digger. I know I'm not knocking grave diggers, but from the greatest rabbi to somebody who's illiterate, you both, if you're Jewish men, have to put on tefillin. You both and your wives, if they're Jewish, have to keep kosher. There's no hierarchy. I put on tefillin, you put on tefillin, right? It doesn't matter. It could be somebody who's an atheist. Just stop it already. Put on the tefillin, right? But so that's mitzvahs. But when it comes now to love of God and fear of God, awe of God, right? So he says then there are different types of people. Some really dig deep to get it. They dig deep by studying, and they dig deep by meditating and Herman cogitating, etc. So they dig real deep. Others, they don't dig deep. There's a natural innate, as the author said many moons ago. There's an innate love and fear of God. It's there, and because it's there, you don't have to create it. You just have to uncover it. But there are those that don't factor in the innate love. They want to generate it themselves, right? So there's, when it comes to matters of intellect and matters of emotion, we're all different. When it comes to matters of action, we're all the same. So when it uses the metaphor, she girds her loins with strength, just as a warrior gathers strength by girding his loins, so does the soul become more powerful by being enveloped, right, with the divine will, which is drawn down by studying the oral law. So the Alter Rebbe is pitching to study, not just to study the written law, and once again, the written law would be the 5 books of Moses, and then the other 19 books of the prophets. Excuse me, I've been like this all day. The prophets, the kings, the writings, the psalms, etc. But there's so that would be considered like the written law, where it's either God or prophecy. And then you have the Talmud, where it fleshes it out. And the Talmud, by the way, which is the Mishnah and Talmud, which is the Mishnah is written in short form, the Talmud explains the Mishnah in long form. And when the Mishnah says something, when the Mishnah says, it makes a comment, the Talmud immediately, like the Mishnah says, a man has to give a document to a woman, the ketubah, if he wants to marry her. That's what the Mishnah says. Right away, the Talmud says, how do you know this? How do you know? So then the Talmud goes into, it's an incredible exercise of reviewing a biblical verse where it explains that that's how we know you have to give a document, and that's how you know you have to give a ring or item of value, right? That's how you know that it's only a marriage after consummation. That's considered you sealed the deal, so to speak. That so the Talmud doesn't let the Mishnah get away with anything. The Mishnah wasn't trying to get away with anything, but it was just written in short form. Along came the Talmud years later, and sort of got to the brass tacks. How do we know what the Mishnah says? From where do we know it? And there are 13 ways of attaining knowledge in the Torah. So now, after that was a pitch. So that was a pitch to study the oral law. The oral law, by the way, is any Jewish book you pick up from a kosher source. If, providing it's not the books of Moses and the Tehillim, would be considered oral law. Right? Would be considered oral Torah, I should say. Law specifically is books on law, but the oral Torah would be anything that you pick up that is a kosher Jewish book. Right? That would be considered oral Torah. Now, so the Alter Rebbe was trying to tell you that by girding your loins, you'll get love and fear of God. Right? And he says that there's an ideal time, however, to strengthen that love and fear. And that is during prayer. Right? So he says as follows: the occasion and the time for strengthening, right? So basically you've done your you've done your hard work, you've done your exercise, you've lifted your weights, right? And now you have to do the stretching, and now you have to, the next day you'll do lighter weights but more repetition. So he says that if you take the oral law and then you back it up during the morning prayer, and he says the morning prayer specifically is a time of compassion. It's a time when the supreme will is revealed. So he says, so since the supreme will anyway strengthens the arms, the love and fear, and the head, the intellect. So, right, because that's what it does, right? The oral law is the supreme will, and it strengthens our faith, our intellect, and our emotions. So he says, so morning service, which happens to be a time of revealed will, and it's a time of compassion where God reveals his will is revealed. So he says just it's a propitious time for us to strengthen both the grasp of intellectual understanding, grasping godliness, and the spiritual emotions. So during prayer, says the Alter Rebbe, one should meditate, right, on the greatness of God. He says, and so you have the oral law that strengthens you. You have this that strengthens you. He says, and you can be you have both of these very powerful tools at one's disposal to strengthen the intellect and the love and fear. So he says, and therefore, I want to ask a favor. He says, that all those who seek to draw close to God. And he says, let them contemplate what I'm about to say, right? And he says, I wrote it in a letter last year, which by the way, we'll get to that letter, so it's not put in order, but we will get to that letter. And he says, especially, he says, when I wrote last year, I was especially, I concentrated and I pushed for devout concentration during prayer from the depths of one heart. Day after day. Don't get tired of the meditation. Seek God. Try and meditate on a little bit of a higher plane than you did yesterday. And he says, and now, having said that, I'm going to ask again, and I'm going to demand again. So this is something very interesting that the Alter Rebbe, because he feels, And because it's written in other places as well, that prayer is what strengthens the intellect. And faith, prayer strengthens faith, which strengthens the intellect, the comprehension of God and the love and fear of God. So the Alter Rebbe says that, as you know, Jews pray every day, and we have a leader. It's called the Chazan. The Chazan is translated as cantor, but truth be told, it's nice. It's a bonus when the cantor has a beautiful, exquisite voice. But even if the cantor doesn't, it's still a chazan, and they lead the services. So they are the prayer leader. So he says, because the leader sets the pace. So in your daily prayers, he says, who should lead the prayers? He says, in his opinion, a businessman shouldn't during the week, because a businessman is going to want to get to the shop, the business, the law office, right? The operating room. You got somewhere to go, right? He says that therefore who should lead? People who have retired, or teachers that perhaps start later, or those who are fortunate enough to be supported by their parents, right? They study in kollel, they study in the yeshiva for married men. If it's not a long time, they shouldn't study there for a long time. They have to go to work. But those people, the retirees, they should be the ones to lead, because they don't feel the pressure of going to work. And they should go, whether you have a lottery or you say, yeah, we want this person. And he says, this leader should surround himself with those that are also fellow retirees. So that way they can't be pressured. He said, but on Shabbat and Yom Tov, where businesses are closed, it's the Shabbos after all. He says, then the business owners, they specifically should lead, because it says 6 days you should work, and the 7th day is for God. It goes, this is your 7th day. This day is for God. So therefore, it's a business. They should lead, because they have time. You got to give extra time for God. This is the reason, by the way, is that the prayers on Shabbat and the prayers on Yom Tov are much longer than the prayers during the week. So prayers during the week, you can 50 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes, and you're pushing it, right? On Shabbat, it's 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours if you have a sermon in the middle. So it's longer, and he says, and it's designed that way. Right? And so therefore they should lead the davening of Shabbat and Yom Tov. And then, and this is how the Alter Rebbe concludes chapter 1. He says, look, there are many people that come to me for counsel. Many people, right? He had a very large following, and people used to come to him, and that's why he wrote the Tanya, by the way. He wrote the Tanya. In his preface, he says, I don't have the time to answer everybody individually. That's over. That ship has sailed. I just no longer have the time. So therefore, what I want to do is I'm going to write a book of advice, a book of counsel, divine counsel. And when you read it, you'll get the advice there. If you're depressed, this is what you should do. If you're poor, this is what you should do. If you're, whatever it may be. If you have bad thoughts, alien thoughts, foreign thoughts, lewd thoughts, this is what you should do. So he says, so having said that, there are a lot of people still come to me. They still come and visit. So he says, so you should know, if I hear that you rush through your prayers, whether it's during the week or whether it's on Shabbat, and you just rush through the prayers and you don't take prayers seriously, he says, you can't come see me, because you're not doing the right thing by God. You can't not do the right thing by God and then come and try to connect to God through me. You have to do your hishtadlus. You have to do your part, and then you can come to me, and then I'll guide you, and I'll be able to right. And he says, and those that listen, Tove aleim bracha, you should be blessed. So he doesn't want somebody to be echo bepev, echo belev. He didn't want you to have, one thing going on in your heart and one thing you're saying. He wants you to be true, real, outside in, inside out. He's not looking for somebody that has a very peripheral relationship with God, but wants a deep relationship with him. So as the righteous tzaddik can guide him. No, you have to do your part. It's like anything else. This is the way God set it up. There's a partnership here, right? So it's a mitzvah to go to work. It is absolutely a mitzvah to go to work and to be able to support your family, be able to send them to good schools, be able to give tzedakah, etc. That is clear. Nobody argues that it's a mitzvah to go to work, right? And what do? You go to work and you ask God to bless you. If you don't go to work and ask God to bless you, that's foolish, because you're not doing your partnership. You're going to work, you're making all the right moves, etc. Then God will bless you. But if you don't go to work and you just say, I want a blessing, it's kind of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, is that you can't come to me to get spiritual guidance when you're spiritually bankrupt in prayer. So that was his pitch. His second pitch was, take prayer seriously, because prayer will enhance, together with your study of our law, prayer will incredibly enhance your connection intellectually with God and emotionally with God. Any questions? Until we meet again, God bless. A great night.
Good night, Rabbi. Good night.
Good night.